Welcome to Speaking Concretely, the official podcast of the Cement Association of Canada. I'm Adam Auer, President and CEO of the Cement Association. Today we're joined by Kari Hyde, Director of Customer Energy Solutions at the Pembina Institute. The Pembina Institute is a Canadian think tank and a registered charity that advocates for strong policies to support Canada's clean energy transition. They recently released a report titled Building One Canadian Economy, Accelerating Adoption of Lower Carbon Concrete in Ontario and Alberta. Thanks for joining us, Kari.
Thank you so much for having me.
Well, why don't we start by having you just tell us a little bit about Pembina and what they do?
Yeah, you sort of touched on the crux of it, but our work really spans buildings, electricity, transportation, and industry with a strong focus on practical policy and market solutions and looking at kind of the end-to-end of the electricity system and transition through that. A core part of our role is really bridging policy intent with real-world delivery. So understanding what actually works on the ground.
So I think it's probably fair to say for those who are familiar with Pembina that it's probably best known for its work in the energy and transportation space and a little bit more recently in the building space. But maybe you can tell us a little bit about how sort of cement and concrete got on Pembina's radar and became a bit of a focus.
Cement and concrete were a natural first step because they are foundational to the built environment. So housing, all road and bridge infrastructure, and clean energy projects really rely on it. They also have a very large material footprint. So even incremental improvements can have meaningful impacts at scale. And more broadly, this work fits into Pembina's growing focus on supply chains and materials needed to build a one Canadian economy. So we believe that coordinated provincial action today will ensure that as Buy Canadian launches, or has launched now, Canadian innovators are ready to compete and win.
So we've got, I think, a few sort of hints at what's in the report that I mentioned in the intro, but the report focuses on this notion of accelerating the adoption of lower carbon concrete, specifically in Ontario and Alberta. What can you tell us about the report, just in general terms, and then we can get into some of the recommendations?
Yeah, so the report is really about being grounded in the reality that Canada is in this major nation-building moment. We need to build quickly, housing, infrastructure, transit, bridges, roads. And the challenge is that material decisions made today lock in emissions for decades. Concrete is the most widely used material in the built environment, so getting it right now really matters. And the core message of the report is that lower carbon concrete should be the default choice, not the exception. And to do that, we need to harmonize procurement standards and requirements across governments and public owners. Nearly 1/3 of concrete in Canada is purchased by governments. And so the Treasury Board of Canada's Secretariat standard on embodied carbon in construction requires a 10% reduction of ready-mix concrete used in government projects. But right now, inconsistent procurement approaches create uncertainty and risk, which slows adoption across the provinces. So that was really the impetus, I guess, for this work.
That's great. Procurement, as you may know, is a very large passion of many of us at the Cement Association of Canada. I think the report gets at some of the reasons why we think it's so important, and so I do want to pursue that a little bit. But first, the report chose to focus on Alberta and Ontario specifically. I wonder if you could explain a little bit why those two provinces.
Yeah, so we had done some previous work and looked at the BC environment. And then Ontario and Alberta. In Alberta, the cement and concrete industry generate $16 billion annually and support 39,000 jobs across manufacturing, construction, transportation, and engineering sectors. In Ontario, it's $26 billion annually and supports 62,000 jobs across the mining, manufacturing, construction, and engineering sectors. And Ontario and Alberta are very different jurisdictions when it comes to policy, markets, and how construction decisions get made. Ontario tends to rely more on public procurement, policy direction, and owner-led standards to drive change. Alberta has a very strong industrial base, deep technical expertise in materials and manufacturing, and a more market-driven approach to innovation. So their differences were very interesting, but despite these differences, the adoption challenges across them are remarkably similar. The key insight from looking at both provinces is that how lower carbon concrete is produced matters less than how it performs. Whether emissions reductions come from carbon capture, fuel switching, supplementary cementitious materials, or recycled aggregates, the critical factor is proven performance. So if concrete meets strength, durability, and safety requirements, the pathways used to lower emissions shouldn't really matter. That's why focusing on this in Alberta and Ontario made sense to us.
So I'm anticipating some discussion then on a topic we've raised a number of times on the podcast about the difference between performance-based standards and prescriptive standards. And I note that is part of the discussion in the report. But maybe before we get into the specifics, lower carbon concrete is available pretty much everywhere across Canada, and it's been around for quite a long time, and the improvements are obviously ongoing. But it's the adoption, as you suggested, is not quite scaling yet. What are the main barriers? You talked about sort of the commonality of barriers in Ontario and Alberta. What are some of those barriers to adoption?
So the main barriers are less about performance and more about capacity, confidence, and coordination, the 3 Cs. So larger, well-resourced owners and municipalities, as you said, are already using lower carbon concrete. PLC, Portland limestone cement, is, I believe, the preferred choice and is 10 to 15% less carbon intensive than regular mixes, depending on how it's made. And so larger, well-resourced owners can often they have the time and the energy and clear information to be able to use these options. Whereas smaller municipalities, engineering teams, and owners often lack the time, staff, and clear information needed to know what options are available, what has been approved elsewhere, and what could work in their jurisdiction. So when guidance is fragmented, most teams default to familiar specifications, not because better options don't exist, but because they feel safer and they can adopt materials faster. That creates kind of an uneven playing field where only the best resource actors can move first.
So given some of the barriers that the report identifies, what are the recommendations that Pembina makes for accelerating the use of lower carbon concrete against some of those challenges?
Yeah, so the report outlines 4 clear recommendations, mostly focused on accelerating innovation and making lower carbon concrete the default choice. The first is to really modernize codes and standards. So we see this in building codes. If you shift from prescriptive to performance-based requirements, and if we were able to align those across provinces and municipalities, that would really help. This is more about focusing on how, again, concrete performs, not how it's made. So performance-based aligned standards allow multiple low-carbon pathways to compete as long as safety and durability are proven. The second is leveraging public procurement. So if we applied the federal standard on embodied carbon in construction to all provincial procurement, which today ensures that concrete procured for public projects is at least 10% less carbon intensive than traditional concrete, public procurement can send a clear technology-agnostic demand signal at scale. Nearly 1/3 of concrete in Canada is purchased by governments, and aligning provincial procurement with the federal standard really reduces uncertainty and helps lower carbon concrete become the default on public projects. The third one is aligning private sector procurement. So if we use targeted incentives to reduce barriers and accelerate commercialization at scale, public projects alone won't deliver the scale needed. Private demand is essential. 2/3 of concrete is generally procured by private investors. So targeted incentives help close cost gaps and bring lower carbon technologies into everyday commercial and residential projects. And the last one is sort of what I spoke to about capacity and confidence, which is strengthen workforce readiness. If we consolidate guidance, expand training, develop a lower carbon concrete toolkit, essentially a single source of truth for information, many teams told us the challenge isn't willingness, it's knowing what's available and what's acceptable. So that centralized guidance, training, and practical tools will help workers across the decision-making chain adopt lower carbon concrete technologies with confidence.
Great. I wonder if we could talk just a little bit more about the codes and standards piece, because I think this is one which, a lot of people's eyes kind of glaze over when you start talking about codes and standards. But I think, as the report points out, it's pretty essential to get that right if we're going to, enable market uptake for, novel lower carbon solutions in the cement and concrete space, but it would apply equally to other building materials as well. Maybe you can explain a little bit what the difference is between prescriptive and performance based, and why, from the context of reducing emissions, why one might be preferable over another.
Yeah. So if we look at Alberta, for instance, a lot of the work they're doing is on fuel switching and using technologies like carbon capture and storage to actually eliminate the amount of carbon that's left in the finished product of cement and concrete. So there's that. And then in Ontario, if you look at what Ontario is doing, they look at different mixes and using different recycled aggregates and things like that. So they're two very different ways to actually lower the carbon.
Because one doesn't really change the product at all. Like if you're using carbon capture and storage, the cement formulation is the same potentially, whereas
is the same. And it's the same potentially with this, different recycled aggregates that are used instead of like slag and fly ash. If you've got calcined clays or something else that you're using, it shouldn't matter how we get there. If durability and performance is tested, so the how we get there doesn't matter. It's, is there a reduction? And if so, it's just understanding that this concrete might have a slightly longer curing time, and that could be built into, as we talked about, the toolkit of how much curing does this one take versus this one. But overarchingly, at the end of the day, if it's just as strong, it's just as capable, it's just as durable, we should look at the end product and not so much be very prescriptive in how we tell people to get there. So in Ontario, for instance, there are some standards that say you can only use this much recycled aggregate material. When really, if we can use 15 or 20% more, doesn't matter if the end product is the same.
Yeah, we've certainly seen that in jurisdictions across Canada where we have specific requirements around the volume of aggregates or the volume of supplementary cementitious materials, or sometimes they mandate minimum cement contents. And this can all take place in the context of procurement policies that are ostensibly aiming to optimize the carbon emissions from those products as well. So there is kind of a tension there between the solutions that are available and the kind of restrictions that specifications can and codes and standards can put on what the industry is allowed to use. I think that's, obviously from an industry perspective, we are totally aligned with that issue that you identify in your report. And maybe we can kind of extend it then to the procurement piece, which I think is the other really significant recommendation. And they're very much tied to, the notion of code standards, specifications, and procurement. How do you see sort of the procurement piece playing a role in driving that focus on performance-based and kind of sending the signal to the producers of cement and concrete that there is actually a demand for those solutions?
Yeah, so I would say that performance-based approaches really do allow that innovation to enable different types of lower carbon mixes and still maintain quality. What procurement does is sets the signal, the demand signal that this is necessary and we need this today. So having the federal standard on embodied carbon is fantastic because all federal procurement suggests we need at least, at minimum, 10% lower carbon to be procured and utilized in every project. If the provinces and territories adopted the same base level, what we know is that once a procurement policy has been put in place, that becomes the default. That becomes the demand signal that tends to start to push into actual market transformation across the industry itself. So today it's 10%. What we're hoping is we know there's technologies already coming or on the market that are much higher, that are 15 to 20 to 30%. We know the CAC is looking at 50% net, basically zero carbon by 2050. So I would suggest that if we can at least agree across all provinces and territories that this is the base minimum, and we can continue to step up those standards over time, it levels the playing field and opens that demand signal transformation that's required for markets.
Yeah, and then now it's the flow of the recommendations starts to kind of gel together, I think, as you're describing, the next recommendation focuses on investment and traction, right? Which is also a big part of, well, first you need some kind of baseline demand signal, which sends not only a signal for the production of lower carbon materials, but also investment in new technologies that improve the carbon reductions that are possible by the industry. I wonder if you could maybe just take a minute or two to describe in a bit more detail that investment piece.
Yeah, 100%. So we have an output-based pricing system, a carbon pricing system for industrials in Canada. It is backstopped through the provinces who are enabled to have their own. So if you look at Alberta, for instance, we have TIER, which is the Technology Innovation Emissions Reduction Standard. It's EPS in Ontario, Emissions Procurement Standard. Both of these, when used appropriately, can actually take the money that is being invested from these high emitting industries such as concrete and put them back into the system and state, hey, we're interested in you innovating on this. Part of Alberta's Heidelberg project, which comes up and running this year, which is a CCUS, so a carbon capture project for concrete, was funded through these types of funds. So what we're saying is investment tax credits, or a way to actually get back some of the money to do more innovation and to understand where else we can move in this industry, is critical. The other thing is, on the demand side, it would be super helpful to have things like permitting requirements looked at differently for organizations that use lower carbon concrete. So it's all these little checks and balances that we put in place that actually drives the investment in more of these technologies moving forward.
So you're suggesting a bit of a kind of smorgasbord, if you will, of different supports. Obviously, carbon pricing and revenue recycling from those carbon pricing systems is one
Right.
Avenue of support. You mentioned investment tax credits, and of course, there are investment tax credits in place at the federal level for CCUS and other clean technologies. Lower carbon fuels is one of the more recent ones. And that those kind of can work together to help, along with the sort of procurement and market signal,
Right.
accelerate, hopefully, investment in decarbonization at the cement production level as well as the concrete production level.
What we're really hoping that does is level the playing field, because these innovations are more expensive in the short term. They do become, I believe PLC is on cost comparison quality with any other cement now. But it does help level the playing field for innovators to actually invest in more lower carbon concrete technologies.
Yeah, sure. That aligns very well with what the industry's been saying, which is, there's a competition for global capital for the modernization of cement facilities around the world, and that capital will go where the conditions are the most favorable, and that is not just about investment supports. It's also about access to clean energy and skilled labor and stable regulatory environment. Carbon pricing is a big part of that investment piece. But the additional incentives that come through revenue recycling and investment tax credits can really make the difference in terms of Canada becoming a destination for that capital versus other competing jurisdictions. So definitely very aligned with where the industry's head is at. For this report, you engaged with, I understand, over 30 stakeholders. Maybe you could tell us a little bit about who you talked to, and give us a little bit of flavor of what kind of feedback you got in those interviews.
We did engage with over 30 stakeholders: cement producers, engineers, contractors, owners, municipalities, industry associations, as many as we could get to the table. The message was really consistent. Industry knows how to deliver lower carbon concrete, but the system doesn't support consistent adoption. And again, for the smaller, under-resourced players, they emphasize the need for centralized, trusted resources to reduce risk and uncertainty. So it was really across the board that we heard the same stuff over and over, which is basically, we can do this today. The innovations are there, the technology's there. Canada is a global leader here. We just need to unlock it at scale.
So I think that implies, a role for, government policy, for example, and sort of private sector actors. What does it mean? What does the report say, if anything, about how we as an industry, as cement producers and concrete producers, need to prepare the market for using our lower carbon products?
Yeah, I think it's more about aligning the signals that shape those decisions. Really, the most important step is harmonizing procurement, I would suggest, across public and private owners, so expectations are clear and consistent. If you're building a building in Calgary, Alberta, it shouldn't be different than building one in, I don't know, Caledon, Ontario. The point is, the standards and everything should be the same so that you could move from one province to the other and be able to understand and work with their concrete mixes. Shouldn't change that. And again, when procurement focuses on performance-based outcomes rather than prescriptive rules, it allows different lower carbon pathways to succeed and encourages that predictable demand across governments, developers, engineers, and contractors. It gives suppliers the confidence to invest and scale. So consistency matters, really, across the entire decision-making chain, from early design through to construction and approval. If you don't have somebody in the early design phase who is comfortable working with these materials, he's going to default to what he's always done. And that locks in that carbon for 50 to 75 years as that infrastructure is in place. So when teams know that lower carbon concrete will be accepted, if it becomes the standard and it performs, risk drops and adoption accelerates.
So it sounds like there's a role for our industry to be out there educating on this stuff. To, obviously, we do advocacy with governments around the policy work, but also letting, the users of our product understand what solutions are available and that they are performative and cost effective.
100%.
So maybe one last question. Usually we end the podcast with a bit of kind of forecasting, if you will. After going through the exercise of producing this report and talking to stakeholders, you mentioned that there are some positive developments, like the federal standard on embodied carbon for federal projects that use concrete. Where do you see things going from here? What's the future for low carbon concrete in Ontario and Alberta?
I think I talked about this a little bit earlier, but we know Portland limestone cement is becoming the default rather than the exception. And so we're already at a 10 to 15% almost overarchingly scale anyway. We just have to hit those smaller market actors a little bit better with understanding how this works. The next phase is about scaling consistency and predictability. We have a real opportunity to align competitiveness, affordability, and climate leadership. It's not really about anymore if this transition is going to happen. It's how smoothly and quickly can we help it move along? How fast can we make this happen? And I think that centralized toolkit, that understanding of procurement and how important it is to set the tone from that government level and then all the way down through industry matters. That's how we see it today.
Maybe just for our listeners, I'll remind them that Portland limestone cement is a lower carbon cement product that reduces emissions by up to 10% based on the addition of unprocessed limestone that reduces the amount of the high intensity clinker that is the source of most of the carbon emissions in cement. And I think you're right to say that we are now nearing almost full scale adoption of that product across the country, which is a great step forward in terms of reducing carbon. Kari, I want to thank you so much for joining us today, and really appreciate your insights on Pembina's report on the acceleration of low carbon concrete in Ontario and Alberta.
Thank you so much for having me, and we very much appreciate the opportunity to come and see the CAC as a big leader in this, and relied on your expertise a lot for the report that we made. So thank you.
Thank you to our audience for listening. And don't forget to subscribe and follow our podcast on your favorite platform. We hope to see you next time.